Yes, 1 second. Dr. T, I think we have to do it individually. I don't think we can do it all together. Like unmute them all at the same time. Can you guys hear everything? Can someone respond using the microphone, please?
All right, we're trying to see if everyone could hear us. All right, well, let's assume that everyone can hear us. Efrain Talamantes, and I'm currently at UC Davis. So I just want to make sure you guys we're all on the same page. Not getting any kind of payment for this presentation. It's solely based on my experiences mentoring medical students, medical school applicants, and really looking at the different literature to help you prepare for these interviews. This does not reflect UC Davis admissions and or any other medical school admissions practices. So I just want to put that out there. The most important thing when you're preparing for interviews is to make sure you begin with the end in mind. I think too often interviews are thought of as this very stressful process that is full of questions, and you really don't have any other reason to go through interviews but to answer questions. And in a way, yes, interviews will involve questions, but if you begin with the end in mind, it's really about where you see yourself 10 years from now, 25 years from now. It's what type of physician you will become. It's where you will practice, who you will serve. And really, it's about impact. It's about what kind of impact you will have on your patients, your community, and most importantly, the medical field. And so as you guys think about your stories and who you are and where you're coming from, it's important to start envisioning who you will become 10, 25 years from now, because that will help you then work backwards and think about, well, what does that mean for me today in terms of this interview? You know, if we imagine that you're currently interviewing at a medical school right now. So interviews, when you think about them, the purpose really is not to just have this stressful interview process or to have a series of questions that are sort of almost feel like they're interrogating you. But the purpose, whether it's a traditional multi-mini interview, an open or closed interview, regardless of the type of interview, the purpose is the same. Many times students will ask me, well, how do I prepare for a traditional interview? How do I prepare for a multi-mini interview? How do I prepare for an open or closed interview. And just to give you a sense, a traditional interview usually will last about 30 to 45 minutes. Multi-minute interviews will be a series of stations that will last anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes, depending on the type of scenario and place. And they vary, and you could have a few stations to many stations. Some schools will have up to 12, 15 stations. Open interviews means that you basically have an interviewer who has reviewed your application, so they may be familiar with what you wrote in your personal statement, and in your secondaries, they may be familiar with some of the metrics that involve your GPA and MCAT and what school you attended. Closed interviews are where you basically have an interviewer who hasn't seen anything besides your name for the most part. And so we'll kind of get into each of these somewhat, and we'll hopefully have some questions and some participation, because we had a lot of really good questions that you guys submitted, so I'm trying to capture those in here in this presentation. So traditional interviews, the way that I would think about it is twofold. Well, what are the pros of a traditional interview and what are the cons? When you think about traditional interviews, the benefit of a traditional interview is that you're with one interviewer, right? So you get to interview with Dr. S, and you get to speak with them for anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. And if you think about it as a conversation, well, that conversation could be very elaborate. There could be a lot of back and forth. They can ask you questions, you can ask questions, and you sort of develop a relationship. Well, the same thinking in terms of the cons, right? Let's say you have an interviewer who's really tough, who maybe is pushing you by asking you really tough questions about some research you did as a freshman that you wrote about in your primary or secondary. That's 45 minutes. So if you start off on the wrong foot and you're with the same person, then again, one person has a lot more weight in terms of the interview versus having the opportunity to say, well, can I get another interview? Or well, no, now you're pretty much in the same with the same person for a little longer. And usually with traditional interviews, you may have a series of them. So you'll have one with a faculty, a community member, or you may have one with a medical student. So you can have a few, and so you may not feel confident with one of them. Well, that doesn't mean it's the end of the day. You still have the opportunity. Rarely do you get just one traditional interview if you do have traditional interviews. With multi-mini interviews, the pros are that there's many interviewers, right? You have less time, which could be a pro, right? Because you could say, well, I don't really have anything else to add. I answered the question. Again, a pro could be that they don't really investigate. So you may say something, and they won't dig deep into it because they won't have time, right? They're trying to get you to answer or respond to a prompt within. On average, what I would say is I try to plan any response, whether traditional or multi-mini interview, for about 5 minutes. A good response is going to take you a little longer, and we'll get into the mechanics of that in a little bit. Again, the pros could be that you don't have enough time to develop a relationship, but that's okay because you may not necessarily connect with the interview, and sometimes you can just say, well, let me move on. So I could see that as a pro or a con, as you can see. So the cons could be that you have a diverse array of interviewers. It's hard to connect with different people. They're too short. It's hard to get your point across. It really does favor strong communicators. So you really do have to practice. The myth is that you don't necessarily, or you can't practice with many interviews. Or the myth is that you don't really need to practice for traditional interviews. So regardless of the interview type, the goal is going to be the same. And you need to practice because it's really about getting to know you. And this is where I find that most students, while they know, they put a lot of effort and energy into their primary application or secondaries, they stress out about the interview and the type of interview and don't prepare, don't practice enough. But the goal of, regardless of the interview type, whether it's traditional or multi-mini, open or closed, is to get to know you. So it's really about you, it's your experiences, it's your passions, what makes you tick, what brings you to the field, why medicine, right? And your future patients. It's about the kind of work you want to do and who you will become. And so that's why when I think about preparing for interviews for whether it's medical school, residency, fellowship, or your first job, you have to begin with the end in mind. And then you really then have to start thinking about the why. A lot of the primary application and the secondaries are trying to get to the why. But in the interview, now you have the opportunity to communicate that. And people get to meet you, and they get to see who you are. They get to hear firsthand about the experiences. They get to understand whether you're really passionate about what you said on your application and writing. And they get a sense of, well, what are you going to contribute to this, not only to the field, but to the medical school, and is that medical school going to be part of who you will become? And that's when it comes down to mission and fit, right? So you want to look at medical schools that you want to make sure you know their mission, and you want to make sure that you focus on the qualities that really speak to their mission. When you think about preparing, everyone talks about you have to know your application. That doesn't mean you have to memorize your application, but you have to remember what you wrote. And so if you wrote about an experience, even if it was limited, if it was your first year in college, which may be, it could be 4 years ago, could be 14 years ago, depending on when you're applying to medical school, you have to be able to be prepared to talk about it. When you think about preparing, there's no substitute for practice. A lot of times I get the response from students, well, I want to sound fresh. I don't want to sound rehearsed. Well, I'll tell you, there's no better practice than being able to communicate what you're trying to say in front of another person, record it, and listen to it. And you have to ask yourself, what did I say? And you have to then think through and say, well, what was it that I was trying to say? And sometimes we think we say things, but when you listen to them, they come out in a very different way. You may use the wrong words that sort of express something that's, that comes off as neutral when you're really trying to express a passion. So practicing isn't necessarily about memorizing words and being able to recite words, or paragraphs word by word, but it's really about communicating and getting your message across in a way that, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. And it's a little harder than you think, unless you practice it out loud or in front of another person. The other thing is use credible references. The AAMC, which is the Association of American Medical Colleges, has a whole section on preparing for medical school interviews. You know, none of this should be new to you. You shouldn't approach interviews as like, I'm just going to show up and just tell them who I am and tell them why I'm so passionate without any preparation, or using friends as a reference, or using someone who told you that, you know, this is a way, or these are the kind of questions they're going to ask you. Just go to a credible source. You don't want to use sources that are not credible. I think they do more harm than good sometimes, especially if you get the wrong information. And this is our plug for MiMentor, and having this Together We Mentor event, is that you want to reach out to mentors, to people in the field, and ask them to perform mock interviews. You don't need to. A lot of times, I get students who say, "Well, I want someone to simulate an entire MMI, and that's the only way I can really practice." Well, that's not necessarily true. And that's kind of one of the goals of today's talk, is to really get you to understand that you can practice for any kind of interview, regardless of the type, and still have a very solid approach that will help you get the results you're looking for. When you get mentors, it's not necessarily many times what, you know, you may sort of say, well, I want you to help me craft the, I want to be able to share and get my point across with the right words, or I want to be very exact. And it's not necessarily that. I think when you think about, even when you listen to people, it's about asking them, you know, sort of, did I get my main message across? It's not necessarily the technicalities of, did I get the right words, and, you know, did I, you know, have complete sentences? I think most of us don't speak that way. We don't speak in paragraph form, where we, you know, go from beginning to end and it's a complete sentence. Many of us will jump from, you know, half-put sentence and then go to a statement, and then we'll make, you know, you might say a couple words and then backtrack and then start saying something else. So, and that's okay, as long as you're getting your main message across. If you're struggling so much you can't get your message across, that's going to be an issue. You also want to make sure you ask people, how did my response make you feel, right? So this whole interview is an experience for you and for your interviewer. And so you can imagine that a lot of the stress you're feeling, your interviewers are also feeling, although they do it more often maybe than you. They're also looking, and they feel stuff. So if you make them feel bad because of something you said, then they're going to feel bad, right? And sometimes when you have very emotional stories, you have to be careful, and so you have to practice so that you don't, you know, sort of communicate something so strongly that you make people feel bad. You may have to think, well, this is true, and I feel bad, and so I want to communicate that, but then sort of have a plan to say, how can I give closure to this, right? We could talk about some specific examples of that in a little bit. And then the most important thing is there anything else I can improve? And again, a lot of it just has to do with asking for specific feedback. You're not trying to get the perfect answer to like a really tough ethical question. No such thing. There's not a one right answer for every question. This is your story. This is you. It's going to be unique. It's going to be different, and there's no need to try to come up with a perfect answer, because that's not the point. The point is of every single question is to get to know you and your story. So again, just a big emphasis on the mentor piece. Use them. They don't have to be physicians. They could be people that are just willing to give you 30, 45 minutes to tell them why you want to be a doctor, to tell them about yourself, the two hardest questions that come up in interviews, no matter where, no matter what you interview for, not just for medical school. So I just kind of want to stop here. I do want to see if there's any questions before I go into sort of my recommended approach in preparing for interviews and the way that you would respond to any question, whether it's an MMI type question and or a traditional interview. So Annette, if you can help us just make sure people are unmuted and see if we have any questions.
Okay, if you have questions, can you guys submit it through the questions tab and then I'll unmute you?
Can someone test it out? Test question, maybe? All right. Okay, so when you think about, I'll keep looking at the tab to see if there's any questions that come up. When you think about any question and the purpose, right? The purpose is to get to know you. Regardless of the question, I think it's important for you to make sure, right? A lot of people will ask me, well, this doesn't tell me to answer the question. Well, yeah, of course you have to answer the question. But you have to give it context, right? It has to have a background. Like it has to have, more importantly, it has to be relevant, right? So if you get asked about, you know, what's your favorite food? It's easy to just respond and say, well, I love cheeseburgers. If you answer a question like that, then the person in front of you or the interviewer doesn't get to know enough about you. So it's really important to include some context, right? So, you know, growing up, my parents would take me to, you know, I grew up in LA, in which they would take me to go have a hamburger or actually a cheeseburger every weekend. That was a treat for us. That was kind of like our going out as a family event. And it wasn't always McDonald's. It was always like this corner stop, you know, Douglas burgers that were really, or still are, very popular. And so now you can kind of get a sense of that you're adding context to the story, and so the person in front of you gets to know a lot more about you, right? They get to know that you're from LA, you love burgers, you know, that was kind of a bonding moment with you and your family. Again, you can kind of get a little more descriptive, which we'll get to in a little bit. But you can kind of get the sense of why a relevant context is important. It's not just about answering the question, but it's about making sure that it does have, that you give it some context, that you give it a background. The second thing is, of course, it has to have, you have to have an example or experience, right? So in answering that question, again, if they ask you what's your favorite food and all you responded was a cheeseburger, again, it's missing a huge portion, not only of you and your background maybe, but it's also, you're not sharing an experience where the person can really understand you. And so you want to think about a substantive example, something that really illustrates why cheeseburgers, in this case, are your favorite food. And again, you know, sort of in thinking about that, you kind of may have a style of burger, right? So it could be that, you know, it's cheeseburgers with onion rings, and there's a reason for that. And then you can maybe have an example of a time when in thinking about your family where um, there's some vivid memory you can share with the interviewer about you eating cheeseburgers with your family, and what you're really trying to build up to is having a thoughtful conclusion, right? I think that after you answer a question and you finish answering it and you give it some context, you give it a strong example, um, it's like, so what? Well, this is important because as a medical student, I know I'm going to get really busy and I have time for my family. But you know, when I do have free time, I'm going to definitely make sure I go home and go have a cheeseburger with my mom and dad and just enjoy that experience because it's an experience that reminds me of me growing up and it reminds me of who I am. So there's got to be some thoughtfulness in why you chose the background or the context that you're sharing. There's got to be some thoughtfulness in why you chose an example or an experience because it's got to build up to something. You don't want to sort of answer questions abruptly and just finish and say, okay, came up with a perfect answer, but it doesn't share anything about you, right? And again, think about the question, right? Any question, no matter what the question is, it's about you. And so if you don't share anything about, give it some context, give it some background, then they don't get to know you. If you don't give them a really substantive example of what you're talking about, then it's not about you. You know, referencing newspapers or saying what you hear from the news, for example, in terms of like what's the most pressing healthcare issue that's affecting our communities today. Again, you can pick something that was just said on the news, but it's not going to be substantive. It's not going to really give you an opportunity to share maybe something that you just went through when you were volunteering at a free clinic or something you went through in taking care of your own family. But it's got to build towards something. So then it's like the conclusion and being thoughtful, you have to connect it back to why is this important? Why are we talking about this? You know, why am I sharing about, you know, silly example of a cheeseburger? Well, it's not just a cheeseburger. It's my family and what it means to my family to be together. So I hope that kind of helps, and I really am hoping we can have other people talk because I want to be able to have you guys participate in this next exercise. So let's try this again, Annette. Is there a way for us to get people to be unmuted? And what may be happening with the questions is that people don't have permission to ask them, maybe.
Actually, I can see them now, so I'll start unmuting people. The first question is from Lily. So let me go ahead and unmute you. Give me a second.
Okay, cool. So yeah, maybe I just don't see them. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I don't think I see them. I think you see them. But you can go ahead.
Lily.
Hi, this is Lily.
Hey, Lily.
Hi.
Hello.
So we had a question
Hi.
about.
Yes, so my question was, what if you get emotional while speaking during an interview? Say if you're speaking about something that you overcame or anything of the sort, like what, how do you address that?
Right. We're gonna put you back on mute. Sounds like you're at a coffee shop, which is okay. So the most important thing I would say about emotion is that it really goes back to practicing. If you haven't practiced the delivery of a response enough, you're going to get emotional. I can give you, as an interviewer, I can ask you, what's your favorite color? And if you haven't practiced responding, because you're going to be so emotional just because you're like, oh my God, I made it. I'm interviewing. I'm so close to realizing my dream. Is that if you haven't practiced answering a very simple question like, what's your favorite color? I'm being extreme, but just to give you a sense, if you are for the first time sharing something with someone and you're going to use an interview as an opportunity to share that, chances are you're going to get very emotional. Chances are it's going to come out the wrong way. So my suggestion is if you're going to be sharing things about yourself, only share things that you've practiced at least a minimum of a few times and that you've done it out loud. Don't practice in your head. We can perfect things in our own minds to the T, but then when it comes out, especially if it's a really hard question like, tell me about the most significant challenge you had to overcome in your life. Don't let the interview be the first time where you're going to release that. Along with the good response, you're going to release a lot of emotion. You're going to become overwhelmed. Your interviewer is going to get overwhelmed, and it's not going to go well. So the key to that is not to, if you practice enough, there shouldn't be a reason why you get emotional. And sometimes in practicing and in recording myself, I would catch myself using certain words or describing certain scenarios and getting emotional. And so what I would do is I would tweak the words or use different scenarios, maybe look at it from a different perspective. Same story, but you can share now, because you've practiced it, you can now share it in a very comfortable, confident manner instead of sharing it and setting yourself up for a real challenge. Great question, Lily. Thank you so much. Next question.
Okay, Jamie. Jamie, can you hear me? Okay, her question was if there should our approach be different for physicians or students?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'll go into that a little bit in a little bit because that's a really important distinction. I would say that for the most part, I wouldn't change my approach too much based on who's interviewing you. I would think of everyone you come across during the interview as a potential person who is interviewing you. And so I would use the same approach in thinking about whatever you share. Make sure that it's relevant and you're giving it some context, this background. How are you doing? Welcome to the School of Medicine and, let's say this island. How was your trip? Again, it's sort of, well, I'm coming from Los Angeles, from California, and it was a long flight, but I'm so glad that I'm here. Again, you give it some background, right? You tell people kind of where you're from. You may share an experience about the flight, and then a thoughtful conclusion, right? And that's, I'm just glad I'm here. It was rough, but I'm here. So everyone that you will come across, regardless of their status or category, you should use the same approach. This keeps you out of trouble because when people ask you questions that are sort of, and I had this in the some of the pre-questions, was what happens when people ask you inappropriate questions that you may not feel comfortable answering, or you may not want to share. Let's say they ask you, well, what do you like to do on Saturday night? Again, if you use this approach, you're not going to get in trouble. Again, think about, well, why is this relevant, or what's relevant? Maybe they're trying to get at, what do I like to do to relieve stress? As an undergrad at UCLA, I learned how to start. I started to meditate. Um, and I had a really good experience because the coach was very instrumental in helping me understand how to cope with my stresses from just going to school and taking tests and so on and so forth. So, I hope to continue meditating as a medical student or as a physician. I mean, however you feel comfortable. Um, that allows you to still share something meaningful, and you don't come across as rude, right? Like instead of saying, "Well, why are you asking me about Saturday night?" You use an approach that still gives you the opportunity to answer and be thoughtful in the whole process of answering that question. Any other questions?
Yes, Julia had one. Let me unmute her. Julia? Okay, so her question was, when you mentioned sharing a difficult story in a positive way, how would you suggest speaking about the death of a loved one?
Well, I would say, it's complicated. I think I'm getting some echo. Okay. It's really challenging. I think that, as you guys had asked me before this webinar, how do you sort of shine through? How do you bring across all these amazing qualities and experiences you have? And some of them are going to be really difficult, including the death of people close to you. Again, I would say you have to practice it, and you have to ask yourself, one, why you're sharing what you're sharing, and why you're focusing on what you're focusing on, and why you selected that as sort of the substantive example. So let's say that, again, going back to the really difficult situation you had to overcome, and if it's a family member passing away, again, using this approach, what happens is talk about the context, right? So the person you're talking about, let's say it's your mother, and I can imagine, if I lost my mother, right? I would talk about, my mom, she's the first in her family to come to this country, immigrated from Mexico. Her name's Maria. And, when I think about my mother, she was strong. She was someone who carried both my brother and I on her back to work and still managed to come home and clean the house and then had a night job. And I can only imagine how hard she had it, but she's the person who really taught me how to be a strong individual. And I maybe you want to go into the experience and talk about taking care of her through a really tough battle with cancer. This is what sort of really allowed me to think about why I wanted to become a doctor, because and again the challenge could be, and in practicing this, right, is that you discover that the emotion really comes from maybe a doctor who didn't treat your mom well. And so you don't necessarily have to focus on that. While it's true, if you're not ready to talk about that, then that's not the substantive example that you should choose. Maybe you should talk about, again, that the most difficult challenge for you was to see the strong woman slowly start fading away and pass away. And you were just grateful that you were able to stand by her at her very last breath, and that it taught you a lot about end-of-life care and what it means to be there for patients, and that you want to celebrate, again. And I think it's using terms like that, right, in terms of I want to celebrate and honor my mother by being a great doctor and making sure that the next time that a patient like my mom comes to my clinic and they have to deal with something as challenging as cancer, then I'm there for them. So you kind of want to practice it enough where you can kind of identify clearly in some of these responses what the areas are that make you emotional. And then you have to decide, well, if it's important enough for you to share that, then you have to practice it. If you think, well, that's not as important as my mom's strength and who she was and how important that this experience was for us as a family, then you can focus on a different aspect. All right, let's go to the next question.
Okay, they asked how do we address gap years between our undergrad and medical school um, for non-traditional students, so they didn't complete a post-bac.
Okay. Well, I would say that you've probably been asked to address that already in your secondary. Um, so as you think about what you've already responded, you can build on that, and you could be a little more descriptive and so on and so forth. But one, when we talk about traditional, non-traditional, I think those are terms that are kind of somewhat losing a lot of steam. Uh, I would say that most of us are non-traditional who apply to medical school in many senses, but we sometimes don't recognize it. Taking time off or in between undergrad and going to medical school is very, very common, probably a lot more common and becoming even more common as people find other opportunities. What's neat about taking more time is that you've had more time to really reflect, and some of you have had the opportunity to go out or go back into a community as an individual who's graduated from a university, and now you've had the opportunity to make a different kind of impact. Right? A lot of us would pat ourselves on the back as students and say, well, as a volunteer, I put on a health fair, and I did this and I did that, but you really don't. It's hard for us to do a lot, and sometimes you even, may lack the confidence in what you've done. But what's important is to recognize that you did it, and that you may have chosen to work with a certain population that's underserved, which is very important. But I think that when you take a gap year, even if you decided to work before you apply to medical school, one, you've had the opportunity to grow, and two, you have had the opportunity to go out into the world as someone who has a college education, and now you've started to see things in a very different way. So I would really, focus on sharing that, and not see the time off as a deficit, but instead really focus on the types of opportunities that you worked on during that time off or in your gap year. Any other questions?
Okay. Yes, we have a few more. So the next question is it recommended to always tie back answers to medicine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to tie them back to something. I agree that you don't have to tie them back necessarily to medicine, but you may tie them back to health. You may tie them back to the importance of maybe education and health. A lot of us do a lot of work on mentoring others and getting them into higher education and keeping them geared towards getting advanced degrees. And so your conclusion doesn't have to directly tie back to you being a doctor, but you have to always remember that you're interviewing for medical school. And a lot of us want to become leaders and want other degrees, and we want to run for office. Some of us have aspirations to be politicians and really improve care and policy. Well, first you want to convince a person in front of you that you want to be a doctor. And so my caution there is that if your conclusions aren't always coming back to medicine, you may start sounding like someone who wants to get a public health degree. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're applying for medical school. So just remember that. And medical school means you become a clinician. There are some tailored programs that where, again, they're trying to train you to become a physician leader. And so you want to make sure your conclusions go back to becoming a physician leader, not just a physician.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, how do we address weaknesses during an interview? Can we use your approach?
Yeah, so I would say that weaknesses in the same, like, you know, it's not good enough just to say, well, I'm really disorganized. You have to give it some context. You have to give it an example, and you have to kind of come back and give, you know, a thoughtful conclusion to it. And everyone has weaknesses. The one thing I would say is that if you don't practice this question in front of somebody or record it and listen to it, what you're going to find is that the first time you answer this question, either you're going to be way too easy on yourself or way too hard. But you kind of want to land somewhere in the middle. And so giving, you know, for example, a disorganized response, just saying you're disorganized, that only takes a matter of seconds. And if you're preparing, again, you want to prepare for at least a response that takes a good 5 minutes, right? Most MMIs are going to be in that range, right? 5 to 7 minutes. You can have a little bit of a buffer because either you speak too fast or you might speak too slow, depending on how you're feeling the day of. But the more you practice and time yourself, the better. But you may talk about a time where, you know, you were, let's say, preparing for a big conference, right? You were part of a group, a pre-medical group that was really focusing on mentoring high school students who are interested in the sciences, and so you were putting together this health careers conference at a high school, and you were reaching out to the teachers, and they weren't getting back to you. The students were, some of them were signing up, some of them were not, and so you were having a real hard time organizing a lot of people around this conference, and plus you needed to invite speakers and you needed them to get the information they needed to show up, and so you felt really overwhelmed. And so as you're trying to think about, you know, the purpose of this conference and how important it is for the students, because these are largely underrepresented minorities in medicine, and you really have a passion for mentoring these students, you wanted to make sure they had the best health careers conference experience ever. And so while you felt really disorganized, and that's something you're working on, you started to look at and figure out, well, how can I organize myself better? And you may have, you know, reached out to a mentor and asked them how do they organize themselves when they have big events, and you realize that having an agenda where people are delegated certain responsibilities. And so, you know, this is something that I'm going to continue to work on as a medical student. And I know as a physician, many times we're going to work in places or communities where a lot of people may not have organization or the right organizational skills. And so I want to continue to develop these. And so I, you know, started reading a book about how to manage organizations and people. And I think that's a really important quality for me to work on. Right. So now you kind of went from just telling someone you're disorganized to really walking them through an example that is relevant, that gives it some background and context of who you are, that gives a substantive example, something difficult. It's not like you were, just like, oh, well, I was in a small group and, we had to build, you know, uh, some sort of like craft and someone was having a hard time and I had to help them. And, you know, you kind of want it to reflect again your application, your personal statement, your secondaries and things you've written about. So you have to kind of know your primary and secondary, and you have to practice answering these questions so that you can really make these examples more, to enhance these examples. And then come up with some thoughtful next steps. They don't want you to, kind of dodge the question. I think that sometimes these kinds of questions, the sense I get when mentoring students is that, oh, well, I'm just going to pick some strength and make it a weakness, and then that's it. That's not necessarily going to really allow you, again, to share your story, your passion, and all the things that we've talked about.
Okay, there's another one. It's what is the best way to prepare and answer difficult ethical questions and questions regarding current healthcare events? Also, what is the best way to stay up to date to current events that may be asked during the interview?
Okay, good. So excellent question. So I'm only going to say a couple things here. Tell me about yourself. Sometimes this question, people are like, well, wait a minute, do I still use the same approach? Yes, you still want to use the same approach because you want to think about giving, if you think about who you are, it has to do with something that's embedded in your history, right? Like many of us may share, an immigrant background with our parents. That's important to share and give context to who you are and background. Maybe you're, the son or daughter of a single parent. Again, that's context within, right? And then the example, right? You have to think about an example that really, really can demonstrate who you are. Being the first to go to high school or graduate from college or go on into the medical school. And it's not just saying that you're the first, but it's like, what was that experience like? And so add some substance, and then you kind of want to go into giving it some thoughtful conclusion. Now, what I would say is that when you think about answering, tell me about yourself, and you use this approach, it's really going to allow you to be unique, right? So if you just say, hi, my name is Efrain and I'm a pre-medical student, and you're applying to medical school, what does that mean? That means that you're describing yourself as one of almost 50,000 people, right? If you say, I'm Efrain and I'm a pre-medical student from UCLA, okay, you've narrowed it down a little bit, but you're probably still one of thousands of people. Now, if you say, well, I'm Efrain and I'm a pre-medical student from UCLA and the first in my family to go to college, now you've narrowed it down to even less people. So when you think about and practice this question, the goal is to really be able to give a response that no one else can use and let it fit, right? So if you say, my name is Efrain and I'm a pre-med student and I really want to go to medical school because I want to help people, think about how many people does that apply to. One, it allow us to get to know you, and two, you do an injustice to sharing anything about yourself and all the qualities that you have to bring. And so the second issue with this question is people are always like, where do I start and where do I end? And I can, talk forever. Well, again, you have to prioritize and think about, well, what's really relevant about me? What can I share about my background or my life story? And what example can I choose, right? You have to choose one where people would say, yep, that's how I would think about this person. That's Dr. Efrain Talamantes. That encapsulates who he is. And so I could totally feel it, hear it, see it, and feel it. So again, that's sort of in I just did this right in the first response. If you just say you're pre-med, it doesn't have any RST. So it's really thinking about when you write your responses out, or you say them out loud and you record them, or you're practicing these. Think about, does this have a relevant context or background? Does that am I really providing a substantive example? Is the example not rich enough? Is this thoughtful? Everything I'm saying, is it building up towards me being a great medical student or clinician? I think those are the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself for every single one of these responses. So again, the updated response would have RST, as we talked about. So going back to your question, number one is that you are the expert, okay? Tremendous amount of responsibility. You are completely in charge and in control of your question, of the responses to questions, right? You know your story the best. You were the volunteer. You were in front of those patients. You were the researcher. You were the one that took the time to do the research. You were the mentor. You were the person who mentored a student. So if you don't share these things, then no one's going to know about it, right? Going back to this question, if you get asked about an ethical or a scenario where it has nothing to do with you, then you haven't made the connections. You haven't really thought about your story, you growing up, your family, friends, your community. You haven't thought about all the great volunteer work that you've put on this application, the research. You're not thinking about the mentors or the people who've helped you get this far. You're totally missing something. A good response is going to have RST. So if they ask you about what's the most important healthcare issue affecting your community today, and you heard on the radio that it was cancer, but you've never done anything in the cancer field, then you're not going to be able to do RST, right? Now, you may say, well, wait a minute. I truly do believe that cancer is the most important healthcare issue affecting our community today. Okay. If so, if you truly believe that, then what have you done about it? And if you haven't really dwelled into that area, then I would say that I disagree with you that you think that you agree that cancer is the most important issue. If you spent the last 5 years of your life working on healthcare, on health fairs, working on access to care, then you should talk about that, right? Or you are working on, or you've maybe not worked on, maybe you didn't have the opportunity to work on the healthcare itself because you were volunteering, but you put on education, health education for patients on eating healthy foods, then that should be the most important issue to you because that's the kind of work you've done. And so in responding to these questions, they have to be relevant to your experience because otherwise you're no longer, if you answer someone else's answer, oops, you won't, you don't know the story. You don't know why you're saying this. You haven't really had a chance to think about the answer. Um, and thinking about sort of the previous questions, many times it's really intimidating to have someone, let's say like myself, ask you, so tell me about health disparities. What do health disparities mean to you? That's very challenging, right? Because you're thinking, wow, Dr. T knows everything about health disparities. Well, that's not necessarily true because I'm only one person. I only have enough hours in a day, but I didn't grow up with you. I didn't do the volunteer work you chose to do. I may not know anything about the volunteer area that you chose. I may know nothing about your research, right? And so you're the expert. You have the opportunity to teach me about why, again, who you are, about why you chose to do what you did, and why it's important, and why you did it, right? If you don't share those things, then I'm never going to know. So assuming that the person in front of you knows everything about you is a really common mistake. For us here, for example, in California, you may know what. I went to UCD for undergrad. Well, is that University of Denver? I mean, you won't know, especially if it's a closed interview. So you want to be able to practice just telling people I went to the University of California, Davis. Especially if you're interviewing someone far away. If you're interviewing at UC Davis, I mean, they're going to know what UC Davis is. So, but don't assume that the interviewer knows everything about you or is going to know what CCM stands for, right? If you're a pre-med and you're part of a PAMSA or something, they're not going to know that. So you have to practice spelling it all out, or you find a way to abbreviate it and say, I was part of a pre-health group that focuses on improving Asian Pacific health, so on and so forth. So you have to practice these things out. Otherwise, people are going to say, what are you talking about? You're just throwing a bunch of acronyms my way. You'll kind of sound like a doctor, right? A lot of us will and with our patients may sound like we're just using a lot of jargon and they don't understand what we're trying to explain to them. You don't want to do that. Okay, so we're finishing up. I just want to get into this question. And again, think about, I'm not going to get into answers for this one, but if you were practicing this question, right, it's thinking about, well, how would I answer this? Well, the sky is blue because, in physics class I learned X, Y, Z. That doesn't give the interviewer an opportunity to really get to know you. You don't really give a substantive example. There's no thoughtful conclusion, no connection. And so you may get, and the reason I use this question is because many times, no matter, I get a lot of this, well, Dr. Talamantes, I want you to really ask me hard questions. Give me the toughest ethical example. Give me the toughest question you can think of. Well, it's not necessarily about how tough the question is as much as it is how you're going to respond, and using all these approaches to making sure you cover the question. And so you can use the same approach to answer this question. And then you have to ask yourself, is this relevant? Does this share something about my background? Does it give a good context? Am I choosing a substantive example? Taking a class in physics alone isn't a substantive example or experience. What was the physics class like? Where did you take it? You can sort of share different dimensions. Thoughtful conclusion, why is this important? You can imagine all the different connections. But if you don't practice questions, it's hard for us to automatically think of this. And so most people will say, well, the sky's blue because I think it has something to do with the sun. And that's it. That's where they end. And again, that doesn't give you an opportunity to really share much about yourself. So going back to a couple of questions that came up. In interviewers, you want to think of your answers as you're responding to your patients, to your community, to your mentees. And so in order to avoid any issues, what would you wear to see a patient? I get questions about jewelry all the time. What should do I wear my fancy, good luck charm watch or something? Well, again, I'm not going to answer these questions for you, but you can think of this and make a conclusion for yourself. How would you introduce yourself to them? Right? Do you just walk in and say, I want to be a doctor because I, blah, 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 blah. Do you not make eye contact? Do you tell them that, you love medicine and all you do is look at, maybe you have your phone on your hand or you have a pen on and you're clicking the pen and you're just nervous? Is that how you would present yourself in front of a patient that you really are trying to help overcome, and teach them about diabetes, for example? What kind of emotions would you express? If you get a question and you feel angry, are you going to yell? Would you yell at a patient? Right? Professionalism, like, well, would you share this with your patient? Would you share this with your community? Would you share this with your mentee? These are really important takeaways, because I think sometimes, yes, you're going to be emotional or nervous, and that builds emotion. And again, if you haven't practiced, the natural tendency is going to be to drop your guard and not think of the interview or the interviews as your patients and community mentees, and you might say something that's completely inappropriate or do something that's completely inappropriate. And my last takeaway is really about communication, and this is probably one of the most challenging tasks that were delegated. How do we communicate our points across? You can't delegate it to someone else. So it's really, as a clinician, I can't ask my MA, my medical assistant, or my nurse, or my physician assistant, or anyone. I can't ask anyone else to communicate for me. I have to do it. And it takes practice. So don't underestimate the practice you will need. MiMentor has a series of events. So if you go to our section, our event section on the site, you can get practice, whether you're in the Central Valley in Sacramento, down at Irvine. We're having an event at UCLA. A huge plug-in for a lot of the student orgs, including the Latino Medical Student Association, the Student National Medical Association. There's a minority health conferences. This is where you're going to find individuals that can really provide you with practice. If you feel isolated or alone, like you don't really have anyone that can help you practice. So I strongly encourage you to, get the practice, use MiMentor as a resource, especially if you're going to interview somewhere, it's out of state, you're afraid, it's far away. Reach out to people. People are always willing to talk about their medical school. People get excited about mentoring you and really ensuring that we have a way to mentor the next generation of students. So with that, I'm just going to answer a few more questions. We can go to about 8:30, and then I'm going to cut out. So don't feel like you have to stay on the session. This is where we'll stop recording. So the questions that are going to be asked now will just be between us and no one else.
Okay, I will stop it right now.